Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Anita Huberman. I'm CEO of the Surrey Board of Trade, and thank you for attending the Surrey Digital Town Hall. And today, this afternoon, we are very pleased to welcome a very special guest, so important to the City of Surrey, BC's Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing, Selina Robinson. Selina, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Anita, for having me. Thank you to the Surrey Board of Trade for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone today.
I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the unceded territory of our Coast Salish peoples, specifically the Kwantlen, Katzie, Semiahmoo, and Tsawwassen First Nations. And at the Surrey Board of Trade, we simply would not have events without sponsorship. And we have two amazing sponsors this afternoon. First of all, BC Housing. They are working with the province of BC, BC's health authorities, the BC Centre for Disease Control, the Public Health Agency of Canada, and other partners across the province to really respond to the pandemic, the COVID-19 crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, we are living in unprecedented economic times. And now more than ever, we see the importance of housing as really being essential as the foundation of living and doing business in each of our cities across the province. On May 27, BC Housing issued a request for proposals for the second round of funding under the Community Housing Fund. Through this RFP, the government of BC is inviting nonprofit and Indigenous housing societies, First Nations, housing cooperatives, and municipalities to really propose new affordable housing projects. And at the Surrey Board of Trade, we have been leaders in terms of advocating to different levels of government for the need for purpose-built rental market housing, affordable housing, to ensure that we have that housing for our economic foundation. You know, these new projects are going to deliver urgently needed rental homes while also creating good quality jobs. And information about this housing fund can be found on BC's housing website, bchousing.org/CHF. The sponsor of all of our Surrey Digital Town Halls has been the Port of Vancouver. They are trading with over 170 different global economies, and they have been essential in terms of driving our national and international supply chain. Surrey has the greatest number of manufacturers in British Columbia. And we'd all like to thank the Port of Vancouver, especially a huge shout out to their frontline workers, the railroaders, the terminal workers, the marine pilots. Everyone makes a difference. Again, thank you so much to the Port of Vancouver. Just a couple of instructions. This session is being recorded. The link of the recording will be sent to you after the session is over. If you do have questions, please put them in the chat function of the Zoom webinar that you are in, and we'll try to get to them. And if we're unable to, we'll respond to them after the session is over. And right from the outset, the Surrey Board of Trade, we have invoked ground zero principles since early March as a result of the pandemic, contacting each of our members, the business community, being that concierge of communications, instigating change at the different levels of government. The Surrey Board of Trade is very pleased to be one of 9 organizations on the Premier's Economic Recovery Council. And we are identifying gaps and opportunities during the pandemic and also for economic recovery, infrastructure investments. We have formed the Surrey Economic Recovery Coalition, which is a collection of local business associations, the Board of Trade, and of course, we've included labor in there as well. And we have regular touch points with the City of Surrey's Emergency Response Center to do that same thing. Really to identify gaps and opportunities. And we have a direct line into the Prime Minister's office to do the same thing. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. And Minister, over to you.
Thank you so much, Anita. It's a pleasure to be here with the Surrey Board of Trade. And I'm speaking to you from the traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples in particular the Coquitlam First Nation. So thank you for having me here. It is such a unprecedented, and I know that word is overused, but it really is unprecedented in so many different ways. You know, it's affecting everybody, small business, local governments, people down to the very core. Certainly in my neighborhood here in Coquitlam, talking with neighbors, you know, some work in the school system, some work in healthcare, some are small business people, some are, you know, working in construction, and everybody's life has been impacted in some way by COVID-19. And what I want to start off by saying is that I have been so impressed as a British Columbian about how well we have been adapting in this unprecedented time, paying attention, you know, regularly to Dr. Henry, listening to Adrian Dix, Minister of Health, and trying to find ways to do the right thing, you know, bend the curve, flatten the curve, so that we could try to get back to a more normal, and air quotes, a more normal sort of business. And we all, I think, appreciate that normal is going to be a while. But in the meantime, I would just want to say how proud I am of everybody in every sector that has worked to figure out how do we move through this unusual time. As a government, we have been working fast to support people and businesses. The $5 billion COVID response plan has been identified as a way to support business, to support communities, to support people. And now that we're in the restart plan, and I know that so many have been excited to get going on this restart plan, we're also seeing that people are being very thoughtful and very mindful about how to do the right thing, how to get a little bit more normal, open up a little bit more of our economy, open up more activity, but at the same time, keep in mind, we have to do it differently. We have to keep each other safe in order to do that. And our government has been working very closely with all the sectors. And again, every sector has really come to the table to develop their plans, whether it's, you know, restaurants and pubs, beauty salons and estheticians, making sure that retail has what they need in place in order to do business safely. So we want to, you know, keep that up, but we also, I think it's important to think about how we come back even stronger, and what are the opportunities, as Anita had said, opening up. What are the opportunities? Yes, what are the gaps? And we have to do that work, but what are the opportunities going forward? Our government has set aside $1.5 billion to support economic stimulus. That's been earmarked to support businesses and labor sectors as we recover for this pandemic. So there's some real opportunity. And the Economic Recovery Task Force is created to help plan for the future. But it's not just that task force's job. I think all of us have a responsibility, regardless of what your business sector is, whether you're in the volunteer sector or in the public sector. We all have a place to contribute to build back better, make us as best as we can be, and so that when we come back, we can come back in a way that works for all British Columbians. So I want to talk a little bit about how I've been working out of my ministry and what that sort of looked like. Certainly with local governments, they have been at the front lines. Mayors and councils and their public sector have been really at the front lines, making sure that people are safe within their communities. They've certainly been doing that in Surrey, but it's all around the province. Part of what I've undertaken in certainly the first 6 weeks, I met weekly with every single local government. There's 189 local governments around the province. And every Thursday, we would get together on phone calls and talk about what needed to happen, how they were taking care of each other, what resources they needed, how they were working with various ministries, how they were working together. And we got through the crisis response phase. And now we meet every other week to talk about the restart phase and what local governments need to help get back to having access to parks and playgrounds, having recreation centers open, helping businesses in their communities reopen, and making sure that everyone feels confident. And part of what's really critical is that we need to develop confidence in our ability to open up our economy and our activity in our communities so that we can get back to building businesses, building our economic sector. But we need to do it in a way that doesn't create any more anxiety for people. People are already anxious, and so we need to be very mindful and thoughtful about that. So local governments have been tremendous partners with us, and they've certainly let us know their concerns around their financial viability in terms of how they're going to be moving forward. British Columbians certainly had heard from local governments around, cash crunch, what was going to happen around property taxes, which is their main source of revenue. The other one is fees, and that those have diminished significantly for a couple of months. So there were some concerns. And so we took swift action. So what we said to local governments is remittance of provincial school tax is delayed until the end of the year, so that they can use that to help with their cash flow situations. So if, for example, in Surrey, that gives them about $100 million to help bridge the next number of months to make sure that they can continue to deliver the services that we all count on as individuals and as businesses. We've authorized local governments to borrow interest-free from their own capital reserves so that they can use it for operating. They have a number of years to pay that back. But again, it's just to free up local governments to get them through the next number of months so that we have a sense of really what the impact is. And that's where the unprecedented nature of this event, we don't know what the impacts are yet. And so it makes planning very difficult. And I recognize the local governments, a lot of them have gone back to their budgets. They were already through often a budget process. Many of them are going back to their budgets and saying, okay, how do we rejig this in order to address the new reality of what we're expecting around revenues? We've also allowed local governments to carry debt for an additional year. This just allows them, again, to have a little bit more room to make the decisions that they need to make. The other thing that we've been doing is we recognize the creative ways that different local governments are helping community restart while being safe. And so encouraging local governments to share information. So we've been a conduit in that regard so that they can learn from each other. And again, it's the unprecedented nature. We have no idea how to do this, so we're learning as we go. But there's some really good learnings there. And so we're making sure that people are learning from each other. And we're going to continue to work with the federal government, with communities, businesses, and industry to continue to help people through this recovery. And local governments and the communities around the province are made up of people. And so really at the end of the day, it's how do we help people wherever they work in the sector, wherever they work in the province? How do we make sure that they can get back to as much normal as possible? So the other part of my file is housing, and I really appreciate you doing some of my work, Anita, and talking about the Community Housing Fund. I do have to say, housing has been a top priority for our government since we took office in 2017. And in 2018, we announced our 10-year plan, investing $7 billion in housing to create 114,000 affordable homes in 10 years. We have 23,000 already underway, about just 1,500 or so, just shy of 1,500, I believe, in Surrey. And we have been, and just to give some context, the previous government in 10 years did, I think it was 22,000. So here we are 2.5 years in, and we've got 23,000. So that's the level of speed with which we are moving to deliver on the housing front. But I have to tell you, the pandemic has really demonstrated, I think, for everybody how critical housing is for people. That we have to make sure that people have not just housing, but appropriate housing that meets their needs. And that has certainly continues to hit home for me in a much fiercer way. And so I feel even more passionate about making sure that we keep doing what we do and perhaps even doing it faster if we can. So we have funding available for supportive housing, and that's for people who have significant challenges with retaining housing. It's what we've done certainly in Surrey on the Wally Strip 135A, where we moved 170 people into supportive housing over a number of days. We took several months to plan that, but we've also been acting now, certainly in the downtown east side with Oppenheimer. We've been doing that. We have thousands of units open around the province, but it really accelerated us through the pandemic to do some of the work as well in Victoria and make sure that that people have safe, secure housing. We've also been investing in women and children leaving violence. We've a significant number of units there that we've been building. It's been 20 years since any government has had a fund directed specifically for this group. And we've certainly been hearing, as a result of the pandemic, about the number of women and children who are at risk and the impact that being trapped is having on these women and children. So again, it makes me want to double our efforts and build more of this housing so women and children can be safe. And we've got a fund for Indigenous housing. We're still the only province that's actually building on reserve. As a government, we've said, it doesn't matter where you live. We need to make sure that people have housing. And so we're still the only province that has stepped up to the plate. And we are continuing to urge the federal government to do what they need to do, which is to build housing on reserve. And of course, we have rental housing for low to middle income households. And that's the Community Housing Fund that Anita graciously promoted for us, that is now open to do another intake. And this is to build over 14,000 homes over the 10 years for a mixed income homes. And people making up to $74,000, so it's middle income, as well as those on the lower income, to make sure that we have a healthy community, that we have diversity in housing, and making sure that we recognize that everybody needs housing. And I want to say that building housing, I think, is an important and critical part of our recovery. And I want to compliment the construction sector for their work. We are so fortunate here in British Columbia. We never had to shut down construction. The industry itself understood what was at stake, understood what it needed to do, took responsibility, made changes, acted on it. And so the public health was comfortable with the decisions that were made. So as a result, we have kept people working, and we need to do that, and we need to do more of that. The last thing I'm going to mention, which is part of my file, is the minister responsible for TransLink. And I know this is critically important in Surrey. There's been a ton of work done to extend transit in Surrey. And of course, transit is a key component of our success, of our restart. People need to get to work, and we need to have a functioning transit to do that. And as we lift the restrictions, we're working with TransLink, and I want to compliment them on their hard work to get a safety work plan together. They have done, I think, an outstanding job. We're starting to see the ridership increase, which is great. The fare box will be open again on Monday, and there certainly is concern around what does it look like going forward, given that we have a physical distancing requirement, we have a transit that is necessary, and how are we going to manage all of that together? And what is the financial what are the financial challenges that TransLink has going forward? And I'm really pleased to say that we've been working closely with TransLink, closely with the federal government, recognizing that there are challenges, and we need to be working together to identify how do we make sure that we have transit in the long run. And I know that other big cities are struggling as well: Montreal, Toronto, Calgary, Edmonton. So this is work that we're doing across the nation. The Premier has spoken several times with the ministers, with the Prime Minister, around how critical transit is, and making sure that we're continuing to invest in transit, and making sure that it's viable, not just for today, but for the long term. So that's work that is continuing, and we'll certainly keep everyone apprised of how that work plays out. But I'm confident that we'll be able to make sure that transit's there for the long run. So that's what I'm here to say. Happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Minister. Surrey is going to be the largest city in British Columbia very soon. And we've had, of course, a thriving construction and development sector and activity even during the pandemic, really building our downtown core, but really all of Surrey. And I wanted to ask you, as an agent of economic recovery, and I mentioned purpose-built rental market housing, what do you think is an agent of change in terms of housing infrastructure? What's your perspective on that?
It's a great question, and it's one that we've been acting on since we formed government. So we've done a couple of things. One, and we have more to do. So one of the first things we did was we brought in rental only zoning, right? That's a new tenure, a new form of tenure. And the idea is that local governments can plan for where rental only should be built. Because they're often, when I became the minister, I asked the sector, I asked the development sector, what are some of your barriers? Like what are the barriers to getting purpose-built rental built? And they mentioned two things in particular. One was the cost of land. It's very expensive. And you're competing with sort of the condo market. And so that becomes a challenge because the competition, land is scarce, competition makes the price go up. The second thing, and I know that you probably have a question about it, is the development approval processes, and that they take a long time. And so those have been very top of mind for me as minister and for our government. And so the first thing we did was we put in the rental only zone so that local governments can say, this is where we want our rental. This is where we need it. The other thing we did, and a lot of people don't talk about it because I like to call it a bit of a nerdy piece of legislation, and that's the housing needs assessment. See, I was a city councilor in Coquitlam, and I remember asking the developers that were building around our SkyTrain before it actually arrived. They were building lots of condos, lots of 600, 700 square foot condos. They were just, I would say every week there was a new one coming before us to make a decision. And I remember asking, where are families going to live? 600 square foot condos. Where am I going to downsize to? Because I live in a traditional family home, and my kids were going to move, and they have now. And while I adore my husband, I will kill him in 600 square feet. It's just not going to work. So where are downsizers going to go to free up single family homes for families? And the response was, well, that's the market demand. And it always stayed with me. That experience and that interchange stayed with me because I kept saying, which market? And they kept saying, well, it's first time home buyers. That's where the market is. But there are different markets, and it really depends on which market you're paying attention to. And there is a renter market. We have a zero vacancy rate. But the renter market doesn't get to push it as much. They don't have the same kind of voice. So what we did was we've developed a piece of legislation that says local governments every 5 years, they have to have a housing needs assessment done. So what are your housing needs? Because I, as a decision maker, when I was on council, had a vacuum. I had no idea what was our housing stock, how much single family did we have, how much rental only do we have, how much duplex, townhomes. I had no idea. What are our needs? How many downsizers are we going to have? Do we have an aging population where people are going to be looking to downsize? Do we have homes for them? Or are they going to have to leave Coquitlam, which is mostly single family, in order to downsize? And is that what we really want as a community, if we want diversity? Do we want young people moving in and living here? So how are we making sure that there's housing, like rental housing, for them? So these were all the questions that I had. And so the housing needs assessment will help inform local governments so that they can make choices based on data that helps them predict the kind of housing they're going to need in the next 10, 15, 20 years so that they could make well-informed decisions. So that also should help, I think, get us some more purpose-built rental. And the final thing is I've been harping to the federal government about their commitment to remove GST on purpose-built rental. Every time I speak with if I get to speak to the finance minister, I've asked our finance minister to talk to their finance minister. I've talked to housing ministers. Please, 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 we need you at the table to help stimulate the development of this kind of stock. We desperately need it.
And Minister, that is part of the Surrey Board of Trade's position as well to the federal government to remove that GST. So we're also, same message, many voices is valuable.
Great.
So with casinos, Minister, they're closed for the time being. How will community gaming grants be impacted? Many not-for-profits and cities rely on these gaming grants as further investments into their own city and to families.
It's a great question. We have in our budget $140 million for gaming grants. locked in for this calendar year. And so my message to those folks, get your proposals ready, and we're going to continue on with the gaming grants. They have not been altered at all, because we do appreciate and value the work that those community groups do. They're so critical to a healthy community, and we want to make sure so we are preserving them, even in this context. Could
they be impacted in the future?
Hard to know. Again, this is unprecedented. It's hard to, this is part of what's made life, I think, difficult for all of us, whether you're a business or a volunteer organization or a city. It's how do we plan not knowing? And so at this point, we are clear that we're committed to the gaming grants through this fiscal year, and we'll have to see what happens. So I have no answer for what might happen next year, 2 years, 4 years. At this point, everything is status quo.
Of course. Minister, I want to ask you about your perspective on local government budgets. They've all been impacted one way or another. From your perspective, how should local governments focus their spending?
I know like I said, I've been speaking with local governments pretty much every week, and now we're down to every other week. And the thing that I love about this file is that it's so diverse. Every local government is different. Every local government has different priorities, and they are all doing their best for the people that they serve. And so again, my hat's off to the folks who have the tough job of making the decisions, and every community is different. So, most local governments are taking another look at their budgets, and that's a good thing to do. I think the landscape before us has changed. And even, I just think about even in our own lives. I mean, I think people have also changing priorities given the COVID experience. And so I think local governments have a responsibility to do that as well. All governments do, around how do we help people get through this? Where should we focus our efforts? So for example, I know that local governments responsible for playgrounds and parks, they're recognizing that parks are going to play a much more central role, given that outside is better than inside right now under these conditions. And so they're focusing and rejigging and making sure that their outdoor activities or outdoor cleanliness is really being the focus, because that's where people feel most comfortable, and that's how we're being advised by Dr. Henry as well. So, that's what a lot of local governments are doing. They're taking in this new information, and they're rejigging based on what they're learning, what we're learning every day, to make the right decisions for their communities.
Minister, I was recently in a panel with the BC Real Estate Association talking about the future of that industry. So important to Surrey. We have 1,400 new people moving into our city a month. And, the optimism was there. We are the Hawaii of Canada. So I wanted to, though, ask your perspective. What do you think about the assessment values of homes, condos, commercial properties? Are they going to decline in British Columbia?
It's a good question, Anita. I don't know. I don't know. The market is the market. And we've always had a very hot market here in British Columbia. I came here with my family in the 70s, and it's always been one of those more expensive places to live. And we don't, and it's only on July 1st that they determine what assessed values are, right, through BC assessment. And so it's going to be really hard because those assessed values are based on sales prices in the neighborhood. So it's really going to be a challenge to determine what's going to happen to assessments and what's going to happen to the real estate market here in British Columbia.
I wanted to ask you about our homeless population. And even though we're a business organization, we have always been leaders in terms of poverty reduction, being part of economic development. And we can't continue to have homeless. It's been so apparent during this pandemic. The BC government has done great things in the downtown east side, elements of what's happening in Surrey, all over Surrey, not only in our own downtown core. Housing is essential. housing needs to be a priority. What's your perspective?
Well, housing has always been a priority for us in our government, and addressing homelessness has been, I think, a significant challenge because it's been ignored for so long. And like I said in my comments, it was one of the first things we acted on was getting the supportive housing up and running. So we have thousands across the province of supportive housing. We did the rapid response to homelessness program when we first formed government in the fall of 2017. Our commitment was to get 2,000 homes for homeless people in 3 years. Well, we did it in 2 years. We really made a concerted effort, and there's absolutely more to do. And so it's actually, doubling our efforts to make sure that we can address this. But it's more than just housing, and I think that's what's really important. And it's making sure that they have the supports. We want people to be successful in their housing. And so making sure people have the health supports, have the social supports, that they're welcome in communities. I have to tell you how heartbreaking it is when, communities come out saying, it's great, but not in my neighborhood. And that becomes a real challenge. And I want to compliment the Burnaby Board of Trade is great, just like Surrey Board of Trade, the Tri-Cities Chamber of Commerce as well, in terms of supporting those actions on the ground and making sure that their businesses understand the economic value it brings to house these folks, and that we have to house them in communities. One of the things that we've learned through the last number of years of this really intensive work is that we need to house people who are homeless in areas where they can still access the drugstore, the grocery store. They can go to the bank. They can go to their doctor. And so it needs to be near business centers typically, because these folks don't have vehicles. They don't have motor vehicles. They need to take the bus or they need to walk. And so we need to make sure that we're housing them in places that work for them. And we've had proposals where folks have said, well, you can put them out, at the far reaches of my community. And it's like, that's not going to work. They have no way then of getting around, of even just getting their groceries. So it's really important that we be mindful about the importance of situating their homes in places where they can function well, but also that we make space for them and that we support their efforts to change the trajectory of their life, and that we put in the right supports for them. And that work is significant work, but we also know, because we've been doing this work now for several years, we know that it works. We can see the outcomes. We have people now in housing that they're getting jobs, they're going back to school, they're making changes in their life. There's one woman who stands out in Richmond, who I had the pleasure to meet. She let us, me and a number of others, sort of see her home. She'd been in there for a number of months. And I'd seen a lot of these because I'm there for the ribbon cutting as the minister, but I don't often meet the people who are housed. And in this case, this woman, Joanne, was living there, and I got to see, she had, crackers and cereal and stuff on the counter in the little kitchen area, and she'd put some artwork up on the wall, and she had stencils that said, "Love you to the moon and back," sort of over her bed, and it was spotless. And I thanked her for letting us come to visit with her in her home. And she said, "I just want to thank you for this home. Before I moved here, I was living in the stairwell of the Van City on 3 Road." And it broke my heart. And so here was this woman who was saying, and I'm stable now, and I'm ready to move out, and I need some affordable rental, which is another piece that we absolutely have to work on. And you've mentioned in your comments, we need more rental that allows people like Joanne to have a good life.
The pandemic has given us an opportunity to innovate. And yesterday, the City of Surrey, we had our Development Advisory Council meeting. And many of those developers and construction agents were complimenting our city on their ability to innovate new technology for public hearings to still take place even during the pandemic, for construction, housing to continue. But Minister, housing projects in the full continuum of the province have been delayed due to red tape or delays in permits. And of course, it varies from city to city. How can the BC government work with different cities, municipalities to innovate technology, expedite approvals, to ensure that we have that housing.
So first of all, I want to say the local governments asked for the tool to do electronic sort of public hearings. And so we worked really quickly to do that. So I'm grateful that, that Surrey is using that technology. And I want to also point out that in 1979, Bill Vander Zalm announced, it was front page news, that he was going to fix the development approval process and he was going to do it, you know, within the year. And it didn't happen. And so this has been an issue for a very long time. And one of the things that we did, we took action a little over a year ago, year and a half ago, where we did a development approval process review. And we really pulled everyone together. We pulled cities together, both at the operating level, so the bureaucracy, as well as some of the electeds. We pulled in as well some of the planners and the planning educators around thinking differently about how do we expedite, how do we move faster. We have a report, it's available online, about what we learned out of that process. We have some low-hanging fruit that we've been working on, and there are some more complex issues about how do we tease out and make the process more efficient. And so that's work that we were undertaking. COVID sort of bumped that work a little bit, but we're coming back to it now that we're, I think, through the most challenging part of the crisis, to go back to that, because now is the time. Now is absolutely the time to move on expediting. And there's a couple of things, there's a couple of stories, just to give some examples to people who are here. So for example, when we learned, for example, that Kelowna has their most experienced permitting person at their front desk. So typically you put your newest person, most local governments put their newest person at the front desk who says, yes, thank you very much. Yes, I see you filled out all the forms. This is great. My senior manager will take a look at it, and it goes on a pile. And then every few weeks, the pile gets taken to the senior manager who then signs off. Kelowna turned it on its head, put the senior manager at the front who looks at it right away and says, here you go. It's good to go. And it shaves weeks or sometimes months off. So that's just an example of a low-hanging fruit. So there's some real best practices out there. So we've been culling that, and there's absolutely more to do, but that's just an example of what came out of that learning. There's absolutely more for us to do, and I'm looking forward to delivering, because we heard that so consistently from the development sector. They have been very clear, and I agree with them. I agree with them. And so we're committed to making that move faster. And also perhaps even helping them finding ways to prioritize certain kinds of projects. So, you know, the purpose-built rental, for example, can that get to the front of the line given the dire need for it? How do we do that? And that would feed in as well with the housing needs assessment, that you prioritize the housing that you need desperately.
And I also wanted to mention the importance of not-for-profit developers as well, and how important they are to our economy, our construction sector, and providing housing to those in need. And we have one, you know, awesome example in South Surrey. And of course, there's always challenges at the local government level of them being recognized a little bit differently than private sector developers, but they bring so much more on occasion at the table. So I just wanted to put that in the back of your mind too.
Absolutely, we're in regular contact with BC Nonprofit Housing. We also have another program called the Housing Hub, which is housing for middle-income families, and BC Housing facilitates with the private sector and sometimes the nonprofit landowners to help them become developers. So to help marry them so that they could do some public good with the very important asset that they have. So we're working with faith communities. So faith communities will get, let's say, a new church, a new congregating hall with kitchen and everything, but they use their parking lot to build housing and they still get their parking. And so, but they leverage their asset in order to deliver a social good. We're doing that with Legions. We're doing that with anyone who is interested. And so we've had some very significant, very successful projects that really deliver on housing affordability for the middle income. We call it the missing middle. It's, you know, it's typically between 75 and 120,000. That group, that family income group. And it requires no government subsidy dollar. It's just using the assets to help to deliver on homes for people who need it. And that's also been tremendously successful for us.
Just some quick questions from the audience. One is about the residential eviction ban during the pandemic. While well-intentioned, it's really causing some challenges for landlords. Is the BC government considering any potential for this eviction ban to be extended? And how will smaller landlords be kept part of that if that happens?
Yeah, it's again, you know, we're in an unprecedented time, and a time when public health is saying you need to distance from everyone. People need to be home, and now's not the time to go look for another apartment. Now's not the time to evict someone because they can't go look for another apartment. And we're going to create homeless people, and and no one wants to do that. And so we put that in, and really it's for a non-payment of rent. And remember, there are people, and that's the priority. There are people who've lost their jobs. There are people who are significantly impacted. I think the number that I last saw was 400,000 in British Columbia. That's significant. And to have an eviction during that time, I can't think of anything more challenging. That's not to say that landlords aren't challenged as well. They too have bills to pay. They too have responsibilities, and no one's denying that, which is why we put in the rent supplement program. And to date, we've had, you know, I think it's over 80,000 at this point, renters who've applied, landlords who have said yes. And so then the money goes directly to the landlord. So the landlord has the opportunity to recoup some of their costs. The other thing that we've learned is that most people are paying, if not full rent, partial rent. So tenants are making their best effort to contribute to the landlords, to their obligation on the landlord. And there's certainly more work to do to make sure that we have a system that works, that's balanced, and but we are in an unprecedented time. We're always reviewing and always engaging with landlords through Landlord BC and others to understand how we can continue to make sure that landlords have the opportunity to pay their bills and do the necessary things that they need to do, but also that we don't have this challenge with thousands of people evicted for non-payment of rent. And so that's really something that we're turning our minds to in terms of supporting and creating some sort of balance and how to do that. We're also not the only province doing this. All the provinces have brought in this ban in this time. I just got off the phone yesterday. I had a meeting with all the ministers across the nation, and we've all done this because I can't think of anything worse than to find out that you don't have a home. And so we're all working together to figure out how to proceed, what next steps need to be, and we've certainly turned our minds to that.
Minister, I have one final question for you, but before I go to that, I just wanted to ask the BC government, you know, the rental supplement is only $500. And of course, we live in the highest cost of living area within Canada. So, you know, with the pandemic, and of course we have to assess how things go. We don't know what the second wave of the virus will look like this fall. Perhaps some reconsideration needs to be taken around that rent supplement as well to support our families, which are part of our workforce too.
Exactly. And so again, it is unprecedented and we moved quickly. I want to give a shout out to BC Housing because they're managing that program and they put it together literally like in a week, like maybe 10 days. It was so quick. I want to heartfelt thanks to the folks at BC Housing for responding so efficiently and so quickly to make sure that we could take care of people. I think we're the only province. I think PEI may have done a rent supplement, but we're unique across this nation. No one else on my call talked about doing a rent supplement. I had heard that possibly PEI had done that, but I always sort of joke that PEI, the population of PEI is the same population as the city of Coquitlam. And so as a province, it's sort of, they have a different capacity and a different way of being. As a province, we're certainly much larger and much more diverse and complex. And so we're the only ones who are doing a rent supplement. It doesn't exist anywhere else in the nation because we are the most expensive place. And that has been very, very welcome. We've had a few lovely notes from some folks where they said it's really made the difference for them. It's really allowed them to feel like they could, get food during this time and still, make sure that their landlord has something so they too can get food. And again, this is really trying to keep people as whole as possible. And going forward, we're going to certainly continue to pay attention to how we can make sure that people have the basic necessities, a roof over your head that meets your needs, food in your belly, the opportunity to engage socially. I've certainly heard from communities, it's not the case in Surrey, but I've heard around the province where internet, for example, has become much more critical. And not every place has high-speed internet in this province. And so what is that going to mean? And what is that going to mean for economic recovery in parts of our province? If they don't have high-speed internet during this time, what is that going to look like? They can't even visit with anybody because they can't do what we're doing right now. So there's certainly lots of work, and it's really flagged for us as a government about where we need to invest to make sure that people can participate in the economy and take care of their families.
My last question to you relates back to the real estate industry. Surrey has a thriving real estate sector, and the challenges that they're facing is related to photographing and showings by licensed realtors, and they're asking for that to be exempted from the new tenant protection because they need to photograph, they need to show a tenant occupied property that's essential to their daily business. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's something that we're absolutely looking at as we start to open up the economy, as we start to get back to a different normal. And we're seeing some activity. We're only in, I think it's week 2 of phase 2. I'm losing track of time. I'm sure everybody else is. And that's absolutely on the front burner around some of these orders. How do we start to lift them and at what point? And we'll certainly be talking with public health about how to recognize that if we're going to do more normal, at what point do we do more normal? And that work is absolutely front burner.
Minister, thank you so much for spending a bit of your afternoon on a Friday before the weekend with the Surrey Board of Trade. Thank you to BC Housing, the Port of Vancouver, for your sponsorship. And everyone, make it a great weekend.